Is there anybody from the public here who wants to make a comment? Does not appear so. Okay, so we will jump right into attendance. Rom? Bob Barry?
Yep, Bob's here.
Welcome. Linda?
Present.
Trick?
Here.
Ajit?
Present.
Here. Lauren?
Here.
Jan?
Yep.
Rachel?
Present.
Rena is not, but Fred is.
Covering for Trina. Yep.
Susan? Jen?
I'm here.
Is Rob here? Angelotti?
I am. I had a little network issue here and just dialed in, but I am here. Good morning.
Good morning. Lori?
Here.
Kathy?
Here.
Maura?
Here.
Got a good crew here. So, Scott, do you want to share the slides? So we're going to jump a bit in the agenda to make sure we have enough time for discussion. So we'll return to updates later. So the next item on the agenda is the data sharing agreements. And we had 2 review sessions this week to go over the baseline draft template. And we had some pretty good conversation. So Richard will take the edits that we discussed and will recirculate another draft of the baseline template with folks later next week. And then the next round of variations will include FERPA, HIPAA, and UI, and then we'll revisit the additional regulatory frameworks for the other agencies. But the issue that came up during the review sessions is the pre-publication review, and we felt that this was a topic that needed wider discussion with the data governing board. If we come to a solution as a group, that's awesome. But I mean, but as long as we can come out of this conversation with just a direction for Richard so that we can put together some draft language, that would be great. So Scott, I don't know if you want to take this now.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk, and then I know we had in the review sessions, we had some good discussion, and I think Patrick and Jan had kind of weighed in on those, so this would be a good time for group discussion. The question kind of came on what's the scope of the review that people are doing before publication. We pulled some of the language here that's in the kind of prior and then the current draft versions. But really the question is, so when there's a data request, you know, the data is pulled from the agencies, matched at Department of Labor, sent to the data requester does whatever analysis they're proposing to do, and then before it's released beyond the short list of people who've been given access to it for that request, it needs to be reviewed by the members of this group who were kind of party to the initial request. So if it's a data request that has Department of Labor and CSCU data, then Department of Labor and CSCU review it before it goes outside of the list of people who've been approved for review of it beforehand. If it's a data request that has OEC and CCH data, then the OEC and CCH reps review it before it goes out for public release. So that has been and will be the general process going forward. The question is just really the scope of that review before publication. And I think the way I think of it is there's sort of like the minimalist and the maximalist kind of approach. So the minimalist approach is you in your role as members of the data governing board are reviewing it just to make sure that it has been kind of appropriately aggregated. So all you're looking to do is make sure that it does not provide or reveal personal individual information in any fashion. You're not looking at the conclusions, the interpretation, and the findings. of the analysis at all. You're just making sure that it's been appropriately aggregated. I think the language that we had in the draft, which I'm not sure really is kind of what we intended, but it generated good discussion. So we want to make sure that we're giving airtime to that, is we put in something about findings. And so that's kind of more of like the maximalist interpretation, where in your role as data governing board members, you're really reviewing not just the aggregation, but you're also reviewing, like, did they accurately interpret the data? Did they, are the findings, solid based on the data kind of as you understand it? So I think that's a possible approach that the DGB members could take, but that's really the scope of the discussion. Do you want the review that you're doing before publication to focus in a more limited fashion just on aggregation, or in a broader fashion on the aggregation, but also the findings themselves? Do they really kind of connect to the data that your agencies are the stewards of? So that's sort of the basis for the discussion. Again, I think Jan had raised this. I know, Patrick, you had some points in the previous review sessions. If folks want to kind of give us a sense of where you want to land, then what we'll do is just sort of try and identify if there's consensus, and then redraft the language in the agreements to reflect that.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. I would add one more thing here, which is that this language that's here in front of us right now really seems to be focused on the issues around confidentiality and privacy, which are obviously extremely important. But we know that there have been other cases where we've had just like the match rate seemed too low, and this and that, and sometimes the back and forth with the requester or the data governing board member, whatever, has identified flaws in something that we've done. And so that type of review is important, even though we don't want in the end have a veto over results. I think I mean, if you don't like the if in the end the research produces results that is not favorable to a certain situation, well, I mean, that's what the results are. I got a call from David Lehman last night, very unhappy about the unemployment rate being too high. Well, you know what? We published the official unemployment rate. On the other hand, if they identify a flaw in the methodology of which we've calculated the unemployment rate, we want to fix it. So there's review that isn't just around the good point I'm making is that there's review that isn't just around confidentiality, and I'm not sure exactly where we draw the line. That's why I thought it was important to have this discussion. But I just wanted to throw out there that there are other things other than just confidentiality that are worthy of review at a pre-publication moment. Particularly if we've done something over here in the hub that is just, we made a mistake, which, has happened. We matched the wrong thing to the wrong thing, and, we want to fix it, and we do.
Rachel has her.
I was being polite. We've had that. Patrick's hesitation or concern. We're in the process. I know I'm having internet issues today. We're in the process of working through an MOA right now, for instance, where we were working through around what the intellectual property clauses look like, who owned them, who owned the analysis, was it considered work for hire? So I think that these are really important considerations, especially for us as an agency, since we're still newer and we do have some data quality issues for some of the data we collect. I do think that there's a need, but it's really difficult to capture the sort of we look bad and we don't like how it looks. That is what the data say. So there's improvements to be made. So I second Patrick's concern, but I don't know if there's any way to capture it more than the acceptable for publication or review before publication and distribution.
Linda, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to add, I think that I agree with what was previously said, but I wanted to also add, it may warrant putting in some more specifics in terms of who's reaching out to whom, because it's simply saying required to share findings with OPM, it can be easily, it's not clear who's reaching out to whom. So I was just going to say, perhaps adding some more language as to whose responsibility it is to reach out, and then obviously contact information.
Okay, Linda, I can cover that one just real quickly because I cut some language out of the data sharing agreements in the slide here, when I'm looking at it now, I realize it's a little misleading. So they're sharing it to OPM as the operating group, and then what it asks us to do is share it back with you, the data governing board members. It's like you'll see it. I just took the phrase out in the language here, but they're doing it so that there's a single point of contact and they don't have to figure out which 5 people. Our job is to figure out like which 5 people it is, but it would get back to you. You're the ones who do the pre-publication review, determine the acceptance for publication. So we don't do that, you do.
Got it. Thank you.
Jeet and then Jan.
So 2 thoughts. One is that institutions may view any review or acceptance as export control from their side. And I've had conversations with institutional researchers who don't like any clause that about review or acceptance, or acceptance implies there are scenarios of non-acceptance. And I don't know what non-acceptance implications are. So I think we may run into issues with what they might perceive as export control. So I like the language here of required to share findings so that it's not secretive, but there's no review of the findings or acceptance of the findings, even though when they share it with us, we will review and offer comments, whether they want it or not, on, hey, I don't think your inferences are supported with the data or whatever, or you're misreading into stuff that doesn't exist because the data don't mean what you thought it meant. So we'll obviously weigh in, but I think just to sort of point that out. The second thing is time frame. I think this would be good to have some kind of time parameter on it that says we will share the findings and give us 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something. And it can be couched in the sense of this appropriate aggregation. I don't know if our current agreement has that, but some kind of time frame would be good to have as well, so that they feel like it's not completely open-ended and things are going to get held up. Because if they feel that way, that will be another export control view from their perspective.
And just Jeet, on the last point, just for clarifications, where I realized like this isn't the full text again. So it says, I think we had 5 business days or 5 days, and I think in the discussions there was more consensus that maybe 10 business days would be a better standard. But there should be a time frame, and I think it seemed like 10 business days was reasonable, so it doesn't hang out there forever. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to do the points of clarification. I know Jan, you had your hand.
Sure, thanks. So I'm thinking, as I hear this input, it all makes sense, and I'm thinking there's a way to incorporate everything. I think one of the reasons why I flagged this initially is because I saw that time frame was virtually 5 days, and it just seemed too short to do a review of any type. But I'm thinking that the kind of review that Patrick was talking about, which is kind of assisting the recipient, the data requester, in their analysis, maybe making some corrections along the way, which is something that definitely happens, at least with one request that I know of that I've been involved with. We kind of go back and forth to make sure that what's being done. I see that as being sort of preliminary to this review, something that just happens during the analytical phase, that in this particular instance, the data recipient, the data requester, the one doing the analysis, is sharing with me their work and allowing me to look at it and provide some feedback. And I see that as being outside of the language that we have in our MOA right now, kind of just as a part of the analytical process. And I think I'd like to have, I would appreciate flexibility in the language to review findings without putting restrictions on it, like Ajit said, so that they can share it with us and we can provide some feedback, and there's a time limit to that. So if we call it findings, maybe and data aggregation, or I think the data aggregation piece is particularly important to specify that we're going to review the data to make sure that that the data is appropriately presented in a way that we can't re-identify individuals. And I think that's probably something that really must be clarified, because it makes a difference in who can see what at what point in time. So within the DSA, there's a place where we list specific individuals who will have access to the resultant data and any derivative products of it before it's ready for publication. And that's a short list of people. It could be a long list, but those people have to sign off on Exhibit C, the non-disclosure agreement as is right now. And those are the only people who should be looking at the analytic data before it's ready for publication. So I think the determination of when it can be released, kind of whatever it is you've done, is after the agencies who are involved have said, yes, we're sure you're not going to be able to identify any individuals with this. So that's why I think that if the language could maybe do both things, we could maybe collectively agree that there's a back and forth that can happen during the analytic process, and the people who would be from another agency, you could see that have to be named in that list. That this particular clause could maybe say findings or they will share findings and we will review for aggregation, so that we have the flexibility to look at the findings and we have the specificity around needing to make sure the data is appropriately aggregated. I don't know. What do people think?
And don't feel like you have to raise your hands. Please just, talk.
This is Jen. I would support, I'm just confused because it's always been about data quality and privacy for the pre-publication review in the past. And so I support Ajit's just comment about being careful that we don't provide for too much opportunity to review the findings, as much as I'm sure we'll have bad findings on our end as well. I think the focus should be on privacy and data quality. I think Patrick's point around match rate, I mean, sometimes the data is, like Rachel said, just not clean or something like that. So I feel like we could make a reference to data quality and privacy, but I think we should be cautious about our end in terms of reviewing findings.
I think, Jen, this is Scott. I think that's where it introduces the wiggle room. So like the aggregation is pretty clear. Like in theory, you could just have a computer do it. You don't even need human review. Just say, here's the rules that we have for, self-suppression, disclosure, avoidance, Jan is shaking your head. So in theory, but the data quality and the matching, like that's much more subjective. And so, you could, to Patrick's example, you could say, well, there's a very low match rate. And so you could say, I don't think you should be drawing conclusions based on, this data because the match rate is very low. Or you could say, I think you can draw conclusions, safely based on this data because the match rate's low. But I think the data quality questions and the match rate, like those are very subjective for the interpretation. And the aggregation is more objective. I'll concede, like it's not completely objective, but the data quality, that's, I think, it opens up a lot of room for interpretation. I think that's just sort of different in kind.
Scott, this is Rob. I think that's a good point. The question about the interpretation here is, are we interpreting the results, or are we just simply saying these are the results and this is what they bear out, and then it's up to whoever we release it to make those interpretations? You know what I mean? In terms of some of the stuff, the conclusions, let's say, the conclusions that are made. I assume we wouldn't necessarily be making conclusions, would we be, and releasing a report like that? Or would we? I mean, that's kind of my question.
Rob, your question is, are we drawing conclusions from the findings? I think I'm not hearing anybody say that we want to do that. That the focusing on what Jen and Ajit said, that it's not our job to do the analysis for the person who's the researcher, and that we need to be able to allow them freedom of academic freedom, so to speak, to make those findings. But that if they were to be able to share those with us, I think that's appropriate, and I don't think people are pushing back on that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I just wanted to make sure that we were kind of clear on that. So when we talk about interpretations, we're talking about like a match rate is low or something like that. That's kind of like what we're talking about providing them with, so that the person doing the analysis doesn't draw any incorrect or, conclusions that might be incorrect based on what the raw data is, right? I mean, that's what you're saying?
I'm a little confused. The match rate review would actually happen probably before the analysis even began. So I got tied up in that thought and kind of lost your point. I'm sorry.
No, okay. So when we go back and forth, that's where those kinds of things would come out before the pre-publication review, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, right. So then we're not making any conclusions here. We're just releasing the data.
Well, there is one determination. Somebody has to make sure the data really are appropriately aggregated. Not somebody, but each agency needs
Correct.
to say it's appropriate. That is an official determination, yes, but not a determination about findings, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Jan. I appreciate it.
Sure.
I'm going to try a concrete example just to so let's say someone does analysis of apprenticeship programs at Department of Labor, and they're in this case, it's not really P20 because you'd be matching the apprenticeship programs to the wage records. Then people go through the apprenticeship programs, they're trying to figure out, did they find employment afterwards? And you go through the analysis and there's a very low match rate. So there's no interpretation, you're just reporting, whatever it is, 60% of the people who went through the apprenticeship program got a job afterwards, but the match rate is very low. Maybe people found jobs out of state, or, they found jobs in employment that's not covered in the unemployment system or something like that. So you could say there's a very low match rate. So Department of Labor might say, I don't think you should be drawing any conclusions about the performance of the apprenticeship program and the ability of people to find employment because, the match rate was very low. Whereas the person who's doing the analysis might say, well, this is, the data is what it is, and this is our best path, and we want to draw conclusions about the performance of the apprenticeship program. So you're not writing the analysis or anything, but just reporting how many people went through an apprenticeship program and found a job is a conclusion of sorts, and you would be reviewing, what is this result? Is it valid based on the data that we have? And all those things, the data quality in the apprenticeship program, might have issues. The matching with the wage records might have issues. Maybe the timing, not enough time has passed, to actually have people find employment because of the nature of the apprenticeship programs or whatever it might be. So there's lots of different points where you might say, for things that are pretty cut and dry, again, you're not writing the analysis, but you might say, well, we're the experts about the apprenticeship data and the wage data, and we feel like, this is a conclusion that you shouldn't be reporting this stat, not even the conclusion that you're drawing on it. So I don't know if that kind of helps clarify it. But those are not questions about, really privacy or aggregation. Those are questions about just does the quality of the data support the conclusion.
Scott. Let me give another example. Scott, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
We've had data sets where people don't report, they don't flag Roberta Willis Scholarship recipients, right, Scott? We've had an entire institution that I know of not flag anyone in their data set. And so when we did the analysis, it showed, 0 Roberta Willis recipients stayed in state. And so that's, to me, an error, not necessarily. I think it's a different analysis to what you just made, which the findings aren't great. You know what I'm saying? That's what I'm thinking about controlling for is well, there was a mistake, that there's no Roberta Willis recipients at that school. It's just their data set wasn't appropriately created to flag that for the analysis. So that's all I was thinking about in terms of data quality. There was obviously an error.
And I would hope that error would be discovered in the back and forth analysis phase that Jan described. And I guess where I'm just uncertain, and that's why I'm so happy this discussion is happening, is how much of that needs to be spelled out in the data sharing agreement, and how much of that we just realize that that's going to be the normal practice of the hub and the requesters and the operating committee and all the people who are involved in making these things happen. And I certainly, speaking for us, if someone were to alert us that, hey, the flag on the Roberta Willis Scholarship was wrong in that data set, we got to redo the matching. Of course, we're going to redo the matching. We want it to be right. And I'm very happy to have those conversations. I am unclear in my own mind in terms of what I would think would be correct in terms of how much of this all needs to be spelled out in the data sharing agreement. But I certainly think it's important that we have this discussion at this level right now. So thank you all. I was one of the people that urged that we have a chunk of time for this topic this morning, and I really feel that that was a very good suggestion on my part. So I will pat myself on the back on a rainy Friday afternoon or Friday morning.
And I was just going to say, from DCS perspective, we've definitely had scenarios multiple times where folks have had data sets, they've done their analysis, they've published something, and their conclusions were all over the place and really not well founded, right? And a discussion like what we're talking about with some back and forth, some comment, probably would have headed that off at the pass. Now, where it goes in the data sharing agreement, if there is a place in the agreement to kind of talk about this back and forth happening during analysis, and making clear that it's you know, to improve the quality of the conclusions and not for control or acceptance or approval or something like that. You know, you have to. I think you're right. Everybody's right that there needs to be language that's super clear that we're offering this. We're not requiring it. We're not, and it, you know, it doesn't mean that we are approving it and you can't publish unless we say so, right? In this piece, for the kind of the final pre-publication review, you could split things out like that to say, look, we absolutely must have an approval for the confidentiality and aggregation, but we may offer comments, which you can take or leave, in these areas in terms of data quality and interpretations and limitations, strengths and limitations of the approach, maybe. You know, so just kind of splitting that out and having language that's super clear about what we're saying and what's required and what's just trying to be helpful.
Yeah, I love that
I have
idea.
to jump off. I'm sorry. Sorry, Jan, I have to jump off to join another call on vaccine app procurement, but but I would actually not want to put too much on how we will go back and forth with the researchers on the findings, as much as just giving time to or required to share the findings with us and then giving us some time. And I totally agree with Patrick. If there are data issues, those should have been found well in advance of final pre-publication review. Totally agree with that point. I also feel that we are, after all, the executive branch, or at least most of us are executive branch agencies. So I don't think that, again, not to control anything, but I think we would want to just have a sense, like if things are going to go south in terms of the findings. I think any agency for that matter, not just executive branch agencies, any organization would want to know if they're going to come out looking really bad. Let's kind of prep some talking points. We accept the findings, but blah, blah, blah. So again, so if we put too much language on how we're going to interact, I fear like that might actually end up limiting us. But if we at least allow us some time, I think that allows for the back and forth. And this whole data sharing is permissive. It's not required. That's the other thing to remember in all this, is that we're not required to share this data. We share because these are items of import for the state, for the agency sharing the data, et cetera. So partly we engage and we wouldn't share it with somebody who we don't trust, some organization, some research entity who doesn't have a track record. So likelihood of trouble, so to speak, is low, but it has happened. Like Fred said, it has happened, and that tells you something. Like if the researcher is out to get you, and you know that has happened. So it's not like it hasn't happened. But I think just giving us the time will take care of it, and having them share the findings. I'm sorry, I do have to jump off, but fascinating discussion, and thank you, Patrick, for raising this.
And just to add to that, I think another place with Fred's idea in terms of where we can document it is to sort of prompt and enable this kind of review is in that list of individuals where we have to list earlier in the DSA who would actually have access to the data as a part of the analytic team. maybe including a phrase or a statement, a prompt to say, remember to include people from participating agencies who you may want to have involved in your in reviewing or be involved in, you know, providing information, something that's speaking very clearly, in assisting in this process, because that will then prompt them to think about those things. This is actually something I have done in the past when I was helping folks fill out the forms that we used to have. Is I would always want them to include the data steward committee member from the participating agency from whom they were receiving the data, so they would have somebody who was designated who could actually be a part of that process.
I think we may have gotten somewhere close to like consensus. I think that in this case, I know Katie and I were kind of looking for enough information to go back and kind of redraft the language in the agreements. And I think it seems like there's some consistency about the notion that there be, you know, encouragement, not necessarily a requirement to share findings, that there's not a veto sort of authority on the findings, so that themselves, the aggregation seems like a bright line like that, you know, has to be part of it for the review for privacy. But I think that putting some language that kind of, you know, reflects that iterative process and the encouragement to involve the staff from the agencies who are the stewards of and own and understand the data actively, I think that would be helpful. And Jan, to your point, making sure that that can actually happen because they signed the appropriate forms is an important sort of addendum to that. Anything else?
I think I've captured all of those notes. So thank you. That was all very, very helpful. So the next item is the technical upgrades. So the most immediate matter at hand is creating an incident response plan. We have recently convened a very small group of Bob from DAS, Patrick at Labor, and me and Scott to just have preliminary conversations about what this incident response plan could look like. We have a draft template that we can use as a model, but we do need additional agencies to help with this process. And so I'm going to turn it over to Patrick and Scott, who are going to walk us through this process.
Well, we had, as Katie said, we had a preliminary meeting. One of the outcomes of that meeting is I realized I need a little more technical help. Fortunately, we have some people here at Labor who are very smart and very experienced with this kind of thing. And so we will be engaging them. Did you have the list of the types of?
Yeah,
I'll pull it up. Slide. Okay, great. So, so when we went through the template, you know, we really focused on this particular section, which has the sort of the three different types of incidents, and you know, two of them I think are pretty straightforward in the sense that, you know, if there is a ransomware attack or if there is unauthorized access, you know, that certainly would be an incident, and we certainly would need to have a response, and up to and including involving law enforcement and who knows what. So that's part of what we're going to work on. And obviously, we would love to have the help of other agencies to help us work on it. So anyone who wants to volunteer or you're certainly welcome. I think from a policy perspective, for this board, I would certainly be interested in hearing anyone's opinions around the inappropriate usage problem and what kind of response would be appropriate and how we might do that. You know, there was some language that was, made it sound like we could audit the entire, we have a data request from Yale. We are certainly not in a position that we're going to audit the entire world of Yale University, because one researcher might have shown some data to one other researcher that they hadn't signed the appropriate form and be able to look at it. So, that might be an incident that might require some sort of response, but the response is not going to be, we try to take down the entire Yale University. That's not going to work. So we got to figure out that particular piece of, because inappropriate usage there's it's such a wide, so many things that could become inappropriate usage that are, I don't want to say minor, because, we take it very seriously. I mean, we give, just an example, you know, we give data to DECD. We require all of it's not a P20 win thing, but we require all the employees at DECD who actually look at that data to sign a non-disclosure agreement that actually mentions criminal and civil penalties. So theoretically, if they show that data to one of their colleagues at the next cubicle who hasn't signed that, they're now, subject to these kind of sanctions. We're hoping none of that happens over there, but that would be considered inappropriate usage if that were to happen in that particular example. So anyway, I'll stop talking now, but that's sort of where we're at in terms of trying to figure out the next steps on the incident response plan.
I want to flag two quick things just on this. So one is to first thank Bob Berry for identifying this, the template for us, and Jeff Brown, the state's CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, for drafting it. There is a template for state agencies to use for developing these kinds of plans, so that should make the process of developing one for P21 much easier. I don't know if it would help for folks to read this for a second if you have not developed or digested the template at some point in the past, but just to kind of review these three types of incidents. This is really the scope. I think the language in the incident response template also says pretty much everything that happens, would fall into one of these three buckets. It could occur in multiple buckets. There could be things that span all three of these, but their sense was that at the end of the day, all the types of incidents, fall into one or more of these three buckets. I don't know, Bob, if there's anything you wanted to cite about the types of incidents, but I think our question was true. Like Patrick said, defining the scope for a plan for P20 win where we could respond, and then really the third one, inappropriate usage, seems the one that is has the most salient for this kind of system.
Right. Yeah, and we had talked too about this is really going to be an evergreen document, because as soon as you have, and I think that's why these types of incidents are just that high level, because there's so many different type of things that could happen. So I think what we just need to do is, who gets notified, what measures do we take, at that point, do we shut down access or whatever it might be. I think those are the things we should just focus on.
We can see if there's hands. It would be helpful if folks had thoughts, particularly in the last bucket, the inappropriate usage, where we should be identifying incidents that merit a incident response. Again, it's an incident response plan. We have a lot of ways that we're trying to prevent all of these incidents, both at your individual agencies and through the sort of collective agreements that we have for P20 win. But what are the kinds of things in any of these, but I think probably particularly for inappropriate usage, that we should be bringing that system into bear, where there's notifications and communication about an incident, and when it needs to be responded to in some fashion, and then what the tools are for that response. The template helps kind of give some tips for that, but I think that's the example, because we're sharing data in some cases outside of agency custody, when we can or should focus on a response to incidents along these three buckets.
Scott, I'm a little wondering, what specific question are you wanting us to focus in on?
So for the incident response plan, we need to define what the incidents are that we would be responding to. And so how should we define the incidents that deserve notification response? So like inappropriate usage, does that include, you know, the scenario that Patrick talked about, if someone shares data with someone that's not on the list of authorized recipients at a data requester, that, you know, is that the kind of thing that would be in scope for P20 minutes in a response plan? I think that's like a good example.
So I think I'm seconding, I don't know the name. I don't think it was somebody other, it was Robert Barry. Hi, I appreciate your comment. And I think it's going to be hard to itemize a list up front because there could be all kinds of ways in which incidents happen. And I think some may be small and may just warrant a please don't do that again. And some maybe require a conversation and some may require a full response. But I think it might help us to focus on, maybe not right now, but to articulate what the process is that would go through that review. I personally think it's hard to anticipate what everything would be. I could start naming some. There's a hack at the hub and DOL's locked down and they have ransomware out there wanting data from our system. Or they've stolen it, they've got a copy of everything that from the last 3 requests that are currently actively being matched, or one particular agency has decided to, a data recipient has identified 5 people on their list of people who can see the resultant data and work on the analysis, and yet we've found evidence that they've actually shared that much more broadly within their organization to a lot of other people. So I think we could come up with lots of ideas, but I think it's going to be hard to identify them all and sort of categorize them up front. So I'm just seconding Robert Barry's suggestion that we focus on the process. Maybe might be helpful. I don't know. What do others think?
Well, no, that's all very good. And I guess the other piece is also what is the response, and that in the sense of, and again, you're absolutely right. We can't figure out every single possible thing that could happen, but we could have a response that, we will never accept another request from Yale University ever again. Well, that's probably not appropriate if it's just like one person saw some data they weren't supposed to see, but maybe there are some, I don't know. I mean, this is why we sort of started this conversation as just the 4 of us, and I thought it might be helpful to try to involve a few more people,
Sure.
either in this forum, or again, I will make the pitch. Maybe you or someone from your organization would like to be part of the next meeting, so it isn't just the 4 of us.
And maybe a suggestion is we can, categorize them as, across these 3 incidences, severity 1, 2, or 3, where if it's a severity 1 where, data has been distributed or something like that, then we have some more draconian reaction to that, as opposed to a Sev 3, which, one person got to see something and it wasn't real critical or something. So we categorize it that way. So they're more generic responses to certain things.
It also really depends. I appreciate those thoughts. It also really depends on the type of data. What data was it? And what's the context within which it was released? It makes a big difference. I'm just sort of beginning to dive into these areas for CSCU and trying to come up with our own. And we have security processes for this, but in terms of assessing the risk of what a particular privacy incident might pose, and the context is very important.
So I'm wondering how we could take that and make a model. Maybe define type of data. If it's PII or PHI or something like that, that would be obviously more critical. if it's aggregated data that's, available, that's non-critical, and the response would be different, obviously. Just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of a matrix where you have your various responses, or at least response levels, laid out, and then the types of data that have been compromised, maybe,
Great. Yeah, good point.
right? And I was thinking about kind of categories of responses, and there's just simple notification, right? Just tell people that something happened. There's warnings that you might deliver to someone, like Jan, you were mentioning, you might have a stern talking to with somebody to say, yeah, what you just did there was really not good. You violated the DSA, and don't do that again, right? But that might then escalate to censure if that becomes a pattern with that particular organization, right, or person. And then regardless of that, of any of that, we might have to take some remediation steps, right? We may have to offer people, identity protection for a while or something like that. So notification, warning, censure, and remediation were 4 kind of broad categories of responses that I was just thinking of.
This is.
Yeah. I would say that's great, Fred. When you brought up identity protection, because you see that all the time, right? When a company, has records taken, but that wouldn't come from this group, right? That would be the offending area, probably, because there's going to be a cost to that, I imagine.
But that's
Probably.
a really good question.
Yeah.
I don't think we've defined in this process where the risk, who is responsible at that level for actually handling when there's a breach that's been defined, and certain laws kick in that then require notification. I don't think we have clarity around who would be responsible for that. Maybe I just need to reread the agreements, but it's not clear in my head. That's a big part of this. Is a very complicated process we're undertaking here in this particular team. It definitely it's important. It's so critical. I'm really glad we're talking about it. We need to have a robust process, and it would probably begins with a method of communication. When an agency discovers something of any type, there probably needs to be a way to log it, even if it's something that happens every once in a while. You accidentally sent me this directly as opposed to encrypting it, or instead of sending it to me through our secure SFTP or whatever it might be. Logging the small things and the big things, and then having a process for each one where the parties who are involved are notified, and then they can weigh in on, maybe according to some rubric that we've established, the way that Fred was talking about it, is this something that, what is the next step? First, communicate with people, and then maybe they look to the rubric to decide how they want to handle sort of the next step with it. Anyway, I'm just appreciating the conversation, knowing that it's not an easy one, and it will take a bit of time to figure it out.
I'll volunteer to be on the subgroup. And Fred, I like your suggestion about like a spreadsheet. I probably could, for the first meeting, I could kind of throw something together, and at least give us all a talking point to kind of tear apart and get something that works.
If you're interested in being a part of this group, can any of you just like raise your hand?
Hold on. I was doing it virtually here.
I can't see all the screens, so yeah, there you go.
That's a lot of hands.
I would, but I'm covering for Trina, so I really shouldn't offer her up.
You can volunteer yourself. I think so. 2 things. So Rachel put in the standard operating procedures from the state IT agency for this, which is, I think, exactly, Bob, what you have sent us. So the CISO has a template, and that's what we're drawing from. I think it's going to yield something like this matrix that folks are talking about. And the reason for forefronting the definitions is because the process and the definitions go kind of hand in hand. And so, like, to use the examples, I think like the one brought up as like a ransomware attack at Department of Labor. That's fairly clearly like in scope. If it's if it affects the parts of their systems that are used for the role as data integration hub, I'll use the apprenticeship data, like let's say that it affects the server where they keep their apprenticeship data, like if they have a ransomware attack on that, does that rise to something where we need an incident response? And probably not, like that's a DOL agency response. Or what if there's a ransomware attack for one of the agencies, for your systems, like CSU systems are shut down because of a ransomware attack? Do we need to mobilize the incident response plan? My guess would be probably not, but the process, the people involved go hand in hand with the definition for incidents. And, I think like Bob said, it's a work in progress, and we'll probably have to be like, permissive at the beginning and then filter out things that, we determined are not relevant. But because it's a shared system, like to what extent is it rely on either the time from staff from your agencies or reporting, incidents that fall into those three buckets from your agencies? I think for DOL and OPM, like they're clearly in scope when they relate to things that pertain to the administration and the integration of data for P20 win. But when it's, an agency system that is, outside of that, or if it's something where it's the system that's producing data for requests on occasion, like do we need to utilize the response plan in that case? Probably not, but so we wanted to have the definition so people are thinking about that. I think that's it on that. But we'll reconvene a small group or a slightly larger group, which is great.
Okay, great.
I think we have to go back to the updates.
So in the last few minutes, we do have some updates. So we have our annual calendar. We've had a couple more data requests submitted to us, but they need to be resubmitted just because they were missing some items. So we'll have a bit more information about that at our next meeting. Again, if you know of any that are about to come in or are being prepared to come in, please, let me know. Give us all a heads up. That's always helpful. And then if you want to go to the next slide. So the SDS COVID-19 webinar is a 2-day webinar on October 19th and 20th. So it's not individual registration, it's registration by state. I've heard from a few of you that you're interested in attending. The registration to submit for Connecticut is September 30th. If you could just let me know by close of business on Monday, that would be great. They are two very relevant topics for this group. If you have any questions, please let me know. But we'd like to have a good crowd there. And then there is the Coleridge Initiative Data Challenge, which is a funding opportunity that I can let Scott talk about it, but in like the last 4 minutes, I don't know. I don't know if we need to. We do have some time to discuss it further.
I'll just give the short version for this. And so you can click and read the link there. It's a funding opportunity. Funding ranges, I think, between 50 to 500,000 for it. There is no obligation to apply. There's no obligation that anyone in Connecticut coordinates on an application, but it's probably in our best interest that if there is interest in Connecticut in putting together any application, it's better, I think, if we coordinate. So if you are interested, I think if you can flag that would be helpful. The deadline is October 20th, is fairly lenient. It's a letter of intent by October 20th. It's not a full application. They review letters of intent and select proposals to go forward after that. So there's about a month to produce a letter. But I think it's, we're in a better position if we coordinate internally. And I think as it's circulated by email, New Jersey, particularly through their SLDS funds is looking to build up interstate collaboration on the Eastern Seaboard from Maryland up to Massachusetts. And I think they've thought about some ways that the New York metro area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut could work together. So I think we also have the potential to look at interstate applications with New York, New Jersey, other states potentially. So that again, like if we're coordinated, it will probably be looked upon more favorably in the review process. So, but no obligation to apply, no obligation to coordinate, but I think, you know, it puts us in a better position. If you read the materials, they have different funding tiers, different kinds of projects that are available. And, you know, it's just, so it's worth looking for. I know a lot of people have been through college trainings in the past, and I think that's been a helpful process to kind of, you know, be able to use the resources they have and learn more about that, and to look at ways for kind of interstate collaboration. If you're interested, please say so. I think you can just let me know sometime before October 20th. You don't have to, but I appreciate it.
Quick question, Katie. I thought I heard you say RSVP to you by Monday, but
Yes.
Monday's the 27th, not the 29th. So I just wanted to be sure. Monday's the right. You have the 29th on the slide. So.
I do have the 29th. So the 29th works, but the sooner the better, so that I can make sure that I can do follow-up as needed.
Okay. All right. No problem. And with that, I got to jump off to another meeting. So thanks, everybody. Take it easy.
Thank you. Okay, well, so next steps. I think we have a pretty good idea of the direction that we'll be moving in for the data sharing agreements. So we'll put together some draft language and work with Richard to put that together and recirculate with all of you. And then we'll be convening a subgroup on the incident response plan, and I'll be in touch with those of you who said you were interested in participating so that we can get a meeting scheduled. And then I will be following up with folks about the COVID-19 webinar for the SLDS. Am I missing anything by any chance? Cool. Okay, well, thanks everybody. I hope you have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
You too.
Thanks, Katie.
Good weekend. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.